On the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, a single aircraft changed the course of human civilization. The bomb it carried, built around roughly 60 kilograms of uranium, detonated over Hiroshima with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. In less than a second, 70,000 people were gone. The world saw that column of smoke and didn't understand how something like this was even possible. The answer it received was American, Oppenheimer, Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project. It was presented as a triumph. Science, industry, everything working at a scale the world had never seen before. That story is true, but it is not the whole story. 3,000 kilometers north and east of Los Alamos, on the western shore of Lake Ontario, sat a town of roughly 5,000 souls, Port Hope, Ontario. It had a post office, a hockey rink, a handful of churches, and a refinery on the edge of town that processed something the residents simply called radium ore. They knew it glowed faintly in the dark. They knew you didn't lick your fingers after handling it. Beyond that, most of them knew nothing at all. They were mechanics, laborers, refinery workers, people who thought they were processing industrial ore. A worker finishing a shift might knock pale dust off his boots at the door, the same boots his kids would step around minutes later. They collected their paychecks, came home and went about their evenings. None of them were told they were helping build a weapon that could erase a city. They were not soldiers. They were not scientists. They were not spies. They were Canadians. And what they were helping build didn't start in a laboratory. It started in a place most people wouldn't survive. On the 16th of May, 1930, a prospector named Gilbert Labine stood on the eastern shore of Great Bear Lake in what is now the Northwest Territories and looked at something that would change the world. Embedded in the grey Precambrian rock was a dark, heavy mineral with a faint metallic sheen, pitchblende, the richest deposit of uranium-bearing ore ever discovered in the Western Hemisphere, sitting in a wilderness so remote that the nearest road was more than 1,000 kilometers away. Labine was not thinking about atomic bombs. Nobody was in 1930. He was thinking about radium, the extraordinarily rare element used to treat cancer, paint luminescent watch dials, and command staggering prices on the world market. A single gram sold for $70,000, and Great Bear Lake held more of it than anywhere else on Earth. He staked his claim, named the site Port Radium, and immediately confronted a problem that would have broken most men. How do you mine a fortune when your mine sits on the edge of an Arctic lake with no roads, no rail lines, and nothing around it for hundreds of kilometers? The answer Labine and his company, El Dorado Gold Mines, arrived at was audacious to the point of madness. They would build a supply chain from nothing, a logistical corridor stretching nearly 5,000 kilometers from the frozen edge of Great Bear Lake to the refinery in Port Hope, Ontario. It would come to be known, in hushed industry circles, as the Atomic Highway. The journey started on water. Barges crossed Great Bear Lake, engines droning for hours, nothing but water, wind and cold stretching in every direction. Then came the rivers. The ore transferred onto a riverboat, the Radium King, moving down the Great Bear River to the Mackenzie, then south through nearly 2,000 kilometers of some of the most uninhabited territory on the continent. If the engine failed or the ice came early, there was no rescue coming. There was no one to call. From the settlement of Waterways in northern Alberta, the ore transferred to rail, east across the prairies, through Ontario, and finally to Port Hope. The full journey took weeks and had to be repeated season after season, within the narrow window when the Arctic rivers were navigable at all. By the mid-1930s, El Dorado's operation had made Canada the dominant radium supplier on the world market, briefly collapsing global prices and putting Belgian Congo's competing mines into crisis. Labine was celebrated. The Atomic Highway was considered a marvel of Canadian industrial ingenuity. And then the bottom fell out. By 1940, the radium market had collapsed. Synthetic alternatives were eroding demand. The mine shut down. The Radium King sat idle. And in Port Hope, hundreds of tons of processed uranium oxide, the unglamorous byproduct of radium refining, sat in steel drums in a warehouse on the edge of town. Workers had rolled them by hand, wiped residue off their gloves, and stacked them without a second thought. Now they just sat there, worthless apparently. El Dorado was hemorrhaging money. The whole operation looked like a very expensive mistake. The drums sat through the summer of 1940, then autumn, then the winter of 1941, and then, on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and every one of those drums suddenly became the most strategically valuable material on Earth. Within months of Pearl Harbor, the United States Army had a problem it couldn't solve and couldn't advertise. The Manhattan Project needed uranium, enormous quantities of it, and despite America's industrial scale, there was no domestic supply of refined uranium oxide anywhere near what the project required. Someone in Washington pulled a file. Someone made a call. The answer pointed north, to a struggling Canadian mining company and a warehouse full of drums nobody had wanted. In 1942, the United States acquired the entire Port Hope stockpile, roughly 1,000 tons of uranium oxide, refined, ready, and sitting in drums that workers had been stacking for years without knowing why it mattered. It was one of the largest transfers of fissile material in history to that point, handled with the quiet efficiency of a real estate transaction. To be precise, Port Hope held one of the largest ready-to-use stockpiles of refined uranium available to the Allies. It was not the only source. The Belgian Congo's Shinkolobwe mine was also critical, but it was immediately accessible, already refined, and already on Allied soil. That combination was irreplaceable. The Americans needed more, a guaranteed ongoing supply. And so, in August of 1943, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King hosted a summit in Quebec City where Roosevelt and Churchill signed a secret bilateral agreement that would not be declassified for decades. The Quebec Agreement formally bound the United States and the United Kingdom into an atomic partnership. Canada was not a signatory. The agreement was strictly between Washington and London, but it was not a bystander either. As the host nation and primary supplier, Canada was granted a seat on the combined policy committee that governed the entire program. We were in the room. We were at the table. We simply weren't the ones holding the pen. The federal government nationalized El Dorado gold mines that same year, bringing the mine, the highway, and the refinery under direct Crown control. Port Radium reopened. The Radium King went back on the river. The atomic highway came back to life, and the men loading the ore did so exactly as they always had. The Dene people of Deline, then known as Fort Franklin, had worked the Port Radium operation from the beginning. They loaded burlap sacks of crushed ore, each one around 45 kilograms, and carried them across portages on their backs, straps digging into their shoulders, dust settling into their clothes in the summer heat. At the end of a shift, a man would brush pale grit from his forearms, pull on a dry shirt, and think about getting home. They called the rock, in their own language, the money rock. It was steady work. It paid. No one told them what it was. No one told them what it was for. In the decades that followed the war, the community of Deline began to grieve in ways that resisted easy explanation. A later government study found no clear statistical increase in cancer rates, a conclusion the Dene community continues to challenge, pointing to patterns that numbers alone fail to capture. What is beyond dispute is the moral failure at the center of the operation. These men were never informed of the risks, never given the choice to protect themselves, and never told what their labor was ultimately building. It was not until 1998 that the Canadian government issued a formal apology and committed to a multi-million-dollar community action plan, more than 50 years after the last barge left Port Radium. The acknowledgement, when it finally came, could not give back what had already been taken. The uranium was moving south, and now nothing was going to interrupt that supply. But uranium alone was not enough to sustain the controlled nuclear reactions the scientists at Los Alamos needed for their research, particularly the plutonium pathway they were pursuing in parallel. They needed a moderating substance, something that could slow neutrons and keep a chain reaction from collapsing. It was called heavy water, and it was available from only one secure source in North America. Canada was already producing it, and almost no one knew where. Trail. British Columbia sits in a fold of the Selkirk Range where the Columbia River bends south toward the American border. It was an industrial town, zinc smelters, rail yards, the smell of sulfur in the morning air. The Consolidated Mining and Smelting Company had run a fertilizer plant there for years. Workers arrived at shift change, ran their electrolytic cells, logged their output numbers, and headed home. Nobody gave the place a second look. That was the point. Beginning in 1941, under the designation Project 9, engineers began quietly retrofitting the Trail plant to produce heavy water, deuterium oxide, a form of water built around a heavier hydrogen isotope capable of slowing the neutron bombardment needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Heavy water was essential to the reactor research program, particularly the work on plutonium production running in parallel to the uranium bomb. Norway's Vemork plant had produced it before the war, but that facility had fallen within reach of Nazi forces and been targeted for sabotage. Trail was what remained, the sole secure North American source for a material the Allied program could not do without. Without it, one of the only viable paths to a sustained nuclear reaction would have stalled, and time was something the Allies did not have. To the workers, the plant modifications looked like a standard upgrade. Men tightened fittings, calibrated gauges, noted that some of the new equipment seemed unusually precise for a fertilizer operation, dials that didn't belong in a fertilizer plant. Nobody explained why. The heavy water moved south across the border in unmarked shipments, documented in records that wouldn't be declassified for decades. While Trail handled production, the scientific work was being done 6,000 kilometers east, in Montreal. The Montreal Laboratory, established in 1942 under the National Research Council of Canada, gathered some of the finest nuclear physicists in the Allied world in a building on the campus of the Université de Montréal. British scientists, French physicists who had escaped occupied Paris, and Canadians worked in conditions of extreme secrecy, cracking foundational reactor problems that fed directly into the calculations at Los Alamos. Among them was a British physicist named Alan Nunn May. By every visible measure, May was a dedicated Allied scientist, methodical, respected, productive. He was also, from the moment he arrived in Montreal, passing information to Soviet military intelligence, reactor designs, isotope data, material quantities, the broad architecture of how the Allied program was actually structured. He was not alone. The Montreal Laboratory, it would later emerge, was one of the most penetrated Allied scientific facilities of the war. The Soviets knew how close the Manhattan Project was to completion, in no small part because of what was leaving Canada. The heavy water was flowing, the uranium had been delivered, the secrets were already moving in the other direction. Summer 1945 was weeks away, and in Port Hope, in Trail, and across the country, workers were about to hear something on the radio that would make everything they'd done suddenly, irreversibly clear. On the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, radio broadcasts across Canada carried the news in language that was careful, measured, and completely inadequate for what had actually happened. An atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. The city had been, in the words of one early bulletin, substantially destroyed. President Truman spoke of harnessing the basic power of the universe. The word uranium appeared in some reports. Canada didn't. In Port Hope, workers at the El Dorado refinery heard the broadcasts and understood something no official briefing had ever prepared them for: the ore they'd processed, the barrels they'd rolled across concrete floors, the dust they'd carried home without noticing. That was what had done this. No one told them. They just knew. In Trail, the men and women who'd spent 4 years running the heavy water cells had been told they were contributing to the war effort in ways that couldn't be specified. Now they could specify it themselves. The gauges they'd monitored, the figures they'd logged, the process they'd kept running through mountain winters, it had fed directly into this. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. Within the week, Japan had surrendered. The Second World War was over. The headlines celebrated Los Alamos. Canada's formal role went unacknowledged, but attention was already shifting to something else. On the 5th of September 1945, just weeks after the bombs fell, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Gouzenko walked out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa with a sheaf of documents hidden under his shirt. What he carried blew open the entire Soviet espionage network operating on Canadian soil. Alan Nunn May was identified, tracked, and eventually arrested. The full extent of what had left the Montreal Laboratory became clear. Gouzenko's defection is widely considered the opening act of the Cold War. The conflict that ended over Japan had, it turned out, already planted the seeds of the next one, and some of its earliest, most consequential chapters had been written not in Washington or Moscow, but in Montreal. The war was over. The world had been remade, and beneath the streets of Port Hope, worked into the soil around the refinery and along every route where drums had been moved and residue had settled. The evidence of everything that had happened was still there. It never left. It's still there. Port Hope today is a town of roughly 17,000 people. It still has its post office, its hockey rink, its churches. The streets are quiet in the way small Ontario towns are quiet, unhurried, a little proud of themselves. But beneath those streets, in the soil of backyards and schoolyards, and along the banks of Corbett Creek, the residue of the Manhattan Project has been sitting since the 1940s. Low-level radioactive waste, distributed quietly across a community that processed the ore, loaded the drums, and went home without ever being told what it was. The federal government committed to what is now the largest nuclear remediation project in Canadian history, a multi-billion-dollar undertaking to excavate millions of cubic meters of contaminated soil from across the town, property by property, and consolidate it into a purpose-built mound on the edge of the municipality. It is slow, unglamorous, expensive work. You can see it in how the town has handled it ever since. Heads down, doing what needs to be done, the same as always. Canada did not decide to build an atomic bomb. Canada was asked to help, said yes, and then stepped back while others took the credit, and the consequences accumulated quietly in the soil. The uranium came from the Arctic. The heavy water came from the mountains. The refining happened in a lakeside town in Ontario. The secrets left through Montreal. The bomb fell on Japan. For decades, this part of the story sat in the background, unspoken, undocumented, easy to overlook. It shouldn't be anymore.